He was the richest man in America. He refused to pay $17 million to save his grandson. He kept a coin-operated payphone in his mansion. Why would a man who had turned a $9.5 million Saudi concession into a multi-billion-dollar oil empire choose the ledger over his family? Stay with me. In the next 40 minutes, I'll trace the money and the wound, how an ethic of capital preservation hardened into a moral pedagogy, and how that pedagogy cracked a dynasty from the inside. 1953 is the year everything changed. A $9.5 million contract in Saudi Arabia looked like another business gamble. It didn't stay a gamble. Over the following decades, that concession multiplied into what many called a $6 billion empire. That windfall built power, influence, private jets, trusts, vaults, and a family name that weighed more than most countries. It also created new problems that money alone could not solve. He moved through the world like an efficiency expert with a moral compass. Every dollar saved was moral proof. Every dollar squandered was a failure of character. The mansion, full of servants and chandeliers, contained a very small instruction. Even luxury had its price. The coin phone was not a gimmick. It was a lesson. Pay for what you use. Teach restraint by design. Make virtue visible. This was not accidental thrift. It was pedagogy. Call it the Methodist wound, a doctrine of strict stewardship turned into a rule book for life. Capital preservation became a way to teach or to punish. Dollars were the grammar of goodness. Economies of affection were measured on a balance sheet. Love, care, and familial responsibility were instrumented through transactions, loans, advances, trusts, and conditions. Why did that become a problem? Because families are not corporations. Trust between kin is not a contractual obligation you can audit quarterly. When a family's emotional ledger is reduced to entries and clauses, the human side of the ledger atrophies. People learn to negotiate love. Children learn that affection is contingent. Grandchildren learn that rescue requires receipts. Think of it as a forensic economic calculation. On paper, refusing $17 million made a kind of perverse sense. Preserve capital, set the precedent, avoid moral hazard. But on the ground, it was a different computation. $17 million out of a $6 billion pool is a sliver, less than 0.5%. For the family, it represented a choice: uphold a principle or save a life. The arithmetic of the vault ignored the arithmetic of the heart. Money creates incentives. So does silence. When a patriarch treats reserves as sacrosanct, every act of withholding sends a message. Independence is required. Dependency is suspect. Vulnerability will not be bailed out. What gets optimized is not family flourishing, but asset longevity. Human capital gets starved in favor of financial capital. Over time, those optimization choices compound. By the time the family's public crisis arrived in 1973, those choices had hardened into public theater. The scene was unmistakable in its cruelty and absurdity. The man who could solve the crisis with a handshake and a balance transfer chose instead to make a sermon out of his refusal. It became a headline, a moral parable, and a wound that patients of wealth still nurse. You can trace the mechanics of the wound in the small things. A coin phone in a mansion is one image. So are restrictive trusts that control a beneficiary's life choices. So are loans with interest that turn mothers and children into debtors. All these structures serve one function: to prevent the depletion of capital. But they also turn family members into account holders instead of relatives. The trust officer becomes a gatekeeper between father and child. The accountant becomes the interpreter of affection. There's a vocabulary for these dynamics in economics: agency costs, moral hazard, signaling, incentives. The patriarch feared moral hazard, the idea that bailing people out would encourage risky behavior. So he designed rules to prevent that risk. In doing so, he created different risks: resentment, secrecy, rebellion, and ultimately, fracture. What does that fracture look like? It looks like relationships measured by transactions. It looks like children who learn to hide needs. It looks like grandchildren who become commodities in the market of attention. It looks like a dynasty rich in assets and poor in social capital. Social capital is invisible until you need it. When an emergency is not a balance sheet item, when it's a body, a relationship, a life, you find out quickly how you have invested. If you invest only in lawyers and ledgers, you'll have none of the informal reserves that actually sustain people. Loyalty, mutual care, the willingness to sacrifice without a written promissory note. The forensic economist in me asks, what were the real costs of preserving capital this way? There's the explicit accounting, legal fees, tax strategies, trusts, administrative costs. But the larger costs are implicit and durable. The fraying of trust, the loss of family knowledge, the public reputational damage that depresses social standing. Those are hard to quantify, but they feed back into the balance sheet. A family whose reputation is damaged loses business opportunities, suffers litigation, and finds fewer willing partners for joint ventures. It's an economic feedback loop triggered by a moral stance. We return to the central paradox. The motive is not always malice. Often it's fear. Fear of scarcity, fear of being taken advantage of, fear that generations will spend a fortune and then leave nothing for descendants. So the solution is to build structures that make depletion difficult. Trusts with rigid rules, boards of trustees, council approvals, and yes, behavioral constraints. But when fear becomes the operating principle, generosity dries up. Empathy becomes conditional. Let me slow the pace a bit and set out a scene. Picture the mansion. Rooms that can swallow crowds, art on the walls with invoices that would make most people faint. In the hallway, a small glass phone box. Guests drop coins into the slot. A servant hovers. The man who fell from headlines into caricature was capable of elegant accumulation and microscopic stinginess at once. For a family member, every request for help was framed as a moral test. Did you deserve it? Could you repay it? Is need legitimate or a strategy? This is where the wound transfers down the generations. Children internalize the message. To be loved, you must be productive. They learn to prove worth. That strain shows up clinically as chronic anxiety, compulsive achievement, and in some cases, self-destructive search for autonomy. Economic self-sufficiency becomes an emotional pedestal you must climb to be worthy of care. That ladder is steep and lonely. Another dangerous byproduct is secrecy. Large estates cultivate secrecy to protect the assets, private accounts, closed books, guarded minutes. But secrecy also prevents honest conversations. Money and power move into vaults. Vulnerability moves into silence. Family gatherings are censored by implicit budgets. Stories don't get told. Histories of kindness don't build up. Without narrative continuity, the family's identity splinters. People create their own sub-stories, which are often stories of grievance. Every dynasty has a taxonomy of costs and benefits. Getty's tax was a moral one. The family paid in trust deficits, unredeemed favors, withheld embraces, missed interventions. Those costs accumulated until crises could no longer be treated as line items. We should also talk about externalities. High net worth attracts attention, investment partners, media, and tragically criminals. The visibility that made kidnapping a viable target was partly the product of that publicity. Oil wealth, headline profiles, and a well-known name. Security becomes an ongoing expense. Insurance and bodyguards are part of capital preservation. But you cannot bulletproof intimacy. The measures you take to protect assets can make the family feel like an asset, guarded, isolated, and transactional. At this point, let me make a small request. If this exploration interests you, consider subscribing. There are more examinations of how money shapes lives. No hard sell, just more stories that look at wealth through the lens of human cost. Back to the narrative arc. The public refusal in 1973 is a hinge. It crystallized a pattern. The reaction was swift and intense. Condemnation, debate, astonishment. The choice was less about the money and more about a message. If you pay once, you will have to pay again. The calculus was institutional. The reasoning was theological. The cost was human. After that moment, the family's story no longer belonged to them alone. It belonged to the public imagination. Stories of harshness travel farther and settle deeper than stories of temperate prudence. Reputation matters for dynasties because their social license depends on it. A family perceived as callous may find fewer partners, less goodwill, and a bleaker future of strained alliances. We can pull back now and consider systemic remedies. What does a healthy dynasty look like in forensic economic terms? First, a balanced portfolio of capital types. Financial capital must be matched by investments in human capital, education, health, family therapy, mentorship, and shared experiences that cultivate loyalty without humiliation. Second, governance, but humane governance. Rules are necessary, but so is room for discretion. Trusts can include discretionary provisions that allow trustees to act not only to preserve principle, but to sustain family members in crisis. Incentives can reward stewardship and empathy, not just productivity. Transparency mechanisms, regular family meetings, shared reporting, reduce secrecy's corrosive effects. Third, psychological infrastructure. Wealth needs not just lawyers and accountants, but psychologists, counselors, and conflict mediators. If you treat scarcity as a moral failing, you should be prepared for the human consequences of that theology. Building in therapeutic resources is not charity, it is risk management. Fourth, intentional rituals of sharing. Instead of sporadic symbolic gifts, embed predictable, meaningful transfers for things that matter. Education, healthcare, starting businesses, or travel that builds shared memories. The goal is to replicate at scale the simple actions that create attachment, showing up, providing when needed, and forgiving without receipts. There's a lesson for anyone who manages resources, family funds, foundations, or the balance sheet of a relationship. Measure the returns on investment not only in compound interest, but in resilience. How well does your capital protect the network of people who rely on it when the unexpected happens? How high is your social yield when markets crash, or when a family member falls ill, or when a scandal erupts? As we move into the final part of this story, the emotional register deepens. Imagine being a child in that household, taught that money is virtue, that poverty is character, that need implies failure. Imagine feeling gratitude to a man who could have fixed everything and chose not to. Imagine carrying that contradiction into adulthood. The same hands that gave you your name taught you how to be guarded with others. For many in that family, the wound was not simply monetary. It was moral dislocation, the experience of being loved only insofar as you proved worthy of being saved. That is the bitter irony. A lifetime spent protecting capital leaves nothing to protect the ties that keep people human. Assets can survive, but for what? A monument of cold solidity? Or a living institution that cares for its members? The forensic economist will close the ledger and add a final calculation: the opportunity cost of over-preserving. That cost is not recovered by compounding. It's paid in cortisol, in fractured marriages, in children who flee wealth to find warmth elsewhere, in reputations that sink like stones. If you are building a dynasty, the only sustainable model is one that treats human flourishing as the primary asset. One last thought before we go. Power has a price. The price is not always measured in dollars. Sometimes it is measured in the quiet rooms where people do or do not call their kin in times of need. The story you saw in headlines about $17 million and a coin phone is really about choices. About a man who taught stewardship as a moral test, and about a family that paid for that pedagogy with its own quiet heartbreaks. If you found this listening useful, consider subscribing for more narratives that blend finance, psychology, and history. It helps keep these conversations going, and it supports careful work that looks beyond the numbers. In the end, the question is simple and terrible. What do you protect when you protect everything else? Preserve the capital, and you may preserve the pile of money. Preserve the people, and you preserve the story that gives that money meaning. The price of power is not only the dollars you save, it is the warmth you forgo in the name of saving them. The true accounting is not in the vault. It is in the rooms where people ask for help and listen. When dynasties fail, it is rarely because their ledgers were wrong. It is because they forgot how to be families. That, more than any headline, is the lasting invoice of the Methodist wound.